Good morning from the ministries of John Wesley in Sandy Springs United Methodist Churches. It's good to be with you again on this Palm Sunday. Now, this Sunday, what I'm going to do in any text, there are about 100 ways to preach it, and this is what came to me this week. But I'm going to begin with giving you a little bit of historical perspective as to what was happening as Jesus entered Jerusalem. In the second part, it's going to be much harsher. I'm going to also comment on a second point that Jesus was trying to make, and then then third, we go to end on a very positive note is what Jesus was trying to communicate to you and me, and something that will help us in our lives. So from Matthew 21 verses 1 through 11 come these words. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent in two disciples, saying to them, "Go ahead into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a coat with her. Untie them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, just say this, the Lord needs them, and they will immediately send them." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a coat the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the coat. They put their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. And a very large crowd then spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the ground. The crowd that went ahead of him and those that followed all the while were shouting, "Hosanna." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred, asking, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." I love parades. I have always loved parades. I used to love Christmas parades. I just love parades. I don't care how big, how small they are. I love parades. And I still remember one of my first two memories in life was of a special parade. We were in a place called Carazinho at that time. It was a town, and there was a parade going on. And leading this parade was a man by the name of Getulio Vargas, who was the president and then became a dictator of Brazil. And even though I was very, very young, I still remember that parade because Getulio Vargas was riding a white horse, and behind him were hundreds and hundreds of other cowboys riding their horses. But he only had he only had the only white horse. That's what I'm trying to get out here. And even as a very small child, I remember how much that impressed me. Parades of this kind were very normal in Roman times. It was a display of power, a display of dominance, a display of triumph. And the Romans were notorious for this. Usually in their parades, after they had conquered a people or conquered a country, a city, first would come the general that had led the troops, and he'd either be in a stallion or he'd be in a chariot, and then would come his troops, and then all the caretakers would come behind, and some of these parades would last hours. And finally, they would bring in the part of the parade the people that had been made captive. And then last of all, they would bring the foreign ruler that they had conquered and his family in an act of humiliation to show their dominance and power. And here, Jesus enters Jerusalem as a parade. He had this kind of parade in mind. But this parade was very different. This parade was very different. Now, scholars, and I'm not a scholar, and scholars know what they're talking about. They know a whole lot more than I do. Scholars say this about this what we call this triumphal entry into Jerusalem. They say it was triumphal entry with eschatological significance. And what they're trying to communicate to us, these scholars, is that Jesus entered Jerusalem. His concern was with the coming judgment, the coming payback of God, and not so much with what was occupying his mind that day. Now, church, this is very noble, and again, I say those scholars know so much more than me. But listen, when as I'm preaching this sermon, and the moments that I had before and the moments after, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to sit and think about the significance of this sermon in a year from now or the impact that my life had on this church. No, what's primarily going to be in my mind after I leave this, after I finish this sermon, is what are we having for lunch? This seems very out of place for Jesus, what these scholars are saying. I think Jesus was much more like we are. His concern was what was before him with his arrest. His concern was, what are they going to do to me? What am I going to have to go through? And his concern also had to be, he knew he was going to be killed. And Jesus was more into the now than he was in the yet to come. And I think his focus was not just on himself, and because it never seems to have been with Jesus, but his focus was on his movement and his followers. His focus on what was immediately before him. And that, church, as a pastor, has been my experience with the many people I've been through as they have passed from this world to the next. They don't sit there and talk to me about the streets of gold, the paradise that they go into. They're pretty much preoccupied on trying to get out of this world, trying to maneuver this thing that they've never been through before. So why did Jesus have this parade? Why did Jesus have this triumphal entry that was so different from the historical parades that used to happen? And I think that Jesus was trying to communicate hope to his people, hope to his followers. I think Jesus wanted to do something that his people would later remember, something that would later unite them. And this thing, excuse me, church, this thing is called hope. You see, hope is not just wishful thinking. Hope is coming up with with goals. Hope is envisioning a different or an outcome to a situation, and then developing the strategies that will enable us to achieve this. I think Jesus wanted his disciples and his followers not to lose hope. I think he wanted them to understand that something that had come to stay, that it wasn't just going to die on a cross. In church, we too need hope, don't we? Hope unifies people. Hope gives us something to work for together. Hope stimulates our thinking as to the strategies that we need to develop to reach a certain outcome. And this, I'll say, church, one of the most important things that happens in churches. If we can't give them hope, they die. And then Matthew says that as Jesus entered the city was saved. Now that's the Greek. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. But the translation we have is that as Jesus entered Jerusalem, the city was stirred. And I think that's a decent, but it's not the best translation of that particular word. Matter of fact, that word relates to seismology. It's the word from which we take seismology, the study of earthquakes. And I much prefer that concept than to simply say that the city was stirred. I love the concept that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the city was shaking as in an earthquake. And it's used twice again in the Gospels. It's used when Jesus dies on the cross, you remember. The earth shook and the tombs were opened. And then again, it's that same word is used in the resurrection, and it's trying to communicate something to us that as Jesus was entering Jerusalem, he was shaking the cages of the religious establishment, and he wanted those people to know it. You see, church, there's a difference between religion and Christianity. Religion is designed to make people comfortable, to make people feel good about themselves. And that's good, but if that's all it does, it's only half the picture. Christianity, on the other hand, so often is made to make us feel uncomfortable. It's made to make us examine our lives and to change what needs changing. And this is the second thing that I think Jesus was trying to that Matthew is trying to communicate to us today. That the church of Jesus's day needed a shaking of an earthquake, just like ours does. So now I'm going to digress a little bit and go ahead and tell you what I'm thinking about. Because one of the things that I think it's happening in America today is that religion has become so complacent, it's just become so concerned with its own self-preservation that it no longer means anything. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. One big church pastor, several people on his staff receive over $100,000 a year for living quarters, and they all related to him. His daughter just bought a $2.3 million house on her own. Here's another pastor, as they like to be called. Another pastor said there's no need to apologize for being blessed. And he travels in a private jet because he says that commercial flying is just uncomfortable. Here's another pastor. Lives in a $27 million house, has a $2.4 million apartment in New York, and when he is not flying around in his Learjet or in his church, he's out riding in his Rolls Royce. Here's another one. He lives in a $6 million house, and he built an airport next to the church so that he won't waste time in getting to his $20 million citation jet. Is this Christianity or is this religion? There's a difference, you know. Another pastor not far from here, if you go to work for his church or if you volunteer in his church, the first thing that they require you to do is that you have to sign a confidentiality agreement that you will not divulge any of the finance information of that church, of what the pastor earns, how they spend their money. Is that religion or is that Christianity? Matter of fact, the Washington Post, they got a guru in style, and he was looking at what these big city churches are doing and what they wearing. And after just a few, watching these pastors on television, he spotted a $780 pair of sneakers and a $3,600 jacket in a $1,250 fanny pack. What do you need a fanny pack for? And of course, a $2,500 croc belt. And I ask you, is this something that Jesus would do? Not so long ago, Lou asked a person that attended one of these churches. She sort of wanted to get an answer as to why the minister had bought his wife this car for what a house would cost. And this church member said, because he loves her. It's tragic, isn't it? Someone needs to shape those gauges. Rick Warren, on the other hand, Rick Warren from Saddleback Church is a good pastor, and he really is a pastor. He really tries to live as Jesus did, and he has blessed thousands and thousands of people. And let me ask you this: what is the difference between Warren and all these other pastors? And the difference, I think, is this: Rick Warren knows Jesus. Church is not about the money, but it's about how we see the money. It's not about the power, but how we use that power. And maybe, church, we too need to do like Jesus and shake our world. Like Jesus, we too maybe should be out there rattling the cages. And the people were saying Hosanna. Do you know what that means? That means save us. Save us from the Romans. Save us from the religious establishment. Save us, if necessary, from ourselves. And finally, Jesus comes riding a donkey in the foal of a donkey. Now, this has tremendous significance. You see, as I told you at the very beginning of this sermon, conquerors always came in their chariots or their stallions. And what Jesus was trying to do, he was trying to communicate an idea that the people in those days would have understood very quickly. You see, a stallion is an animal symbolic of power, of might, of triumph. A donkey, on the other hand, is symbolic of peace and gentleness. What Jesus was trying to communicate to us is that if we're going to conquer this world, it's not going to be by guns. It's not going to be by power. It's not going to be by the use of money. But it is going to be by love and faith and hope. In church, tragically, this country is at war today. It's at war with itself. In my recollection, we've never been so divided as to political parties. We've never been so divided since at least 60 years as to color. We've never been so divided as to affluence or the lack of it. In church, what we are known for today is for our fighting, isn't it? For not getting along, for blaming one another, for trying to do in one another just like those conquerors of old. And the ultimate goal is to one day have a parade and to have their stallions and to bring their conquered people. In church, Jesus is trying to tell us that doesn't work. It's sort of like the United Methodist Church. Soon, in the next 2 years, it will divide, and it's a tragedy, because if people had just sat down and worked things out, and they could have worked things out, we'd have still had a United Methodist Church. But as it is now, both sides refuse to even consider giving an inch. In church, in the end, everyone is going to lose, and we're going to become two insignificant small churches or denominations. The only thing that can win this world is going to be faith and hope and love. So I'm going to close with two stories. And the first one was when I went to one of my churches, and later this person would tell me, he said, Si, when you came to that church, I really didn't like you. Can you imagine that church? Someone not liking me? What's wrong with them? Listen, there are a lot of people that are sane and good, and they don't necessarily like me. So he said, when he said that, I wasn't surprised at all. And he said, I didn't like the way you preached. I didn't like the way you looked. I didn't like the way you talked. I didn't like the stories that you brought in, and there wasn't a whole lot that I liked about you. And I was a little bit miffed and surprised, and so I just waited for him. He said, but then one day you showed up at my house, and you were the first minister that had ever come to my house, and you came to my house, and you sat there and you talked to us, and you acted as though, I know you were busy, but you acted as though you had all the time in the world. And then he said, I noticed that as we were coming out of church on Sunday morning, you not only knew my name, you knew my wife's name. And you knew what I did, and you asked things, questions that were pertinent. And he said, then I decided I'd start listening to what you were saying on Sunday. Church, that person has become a very close friend. And every time I see him before we part ways, every time I see him, he always tells me, he says, Si, I love you. Love won that battle, and faith and hope. How about you? And so finally, they tell the story about my grandfather, Bishop Cyrus Dawsey, who I'm named for, my mother's father. He was the first in the family to be a missionary in South Brazil, along with my grandmother. And he was a wonderful fellow, tall, beautiful voice, just a wonderful person. At one time considered a ministry of healing, incidentally. And among his appointments, one time he was sent to a church that was known for its fighting. They were quarrelsome, hard to get along with. You ever run across those people? Well, their church is like that. And when he went to this church, it didn't take him long to recognize that what people had said about this church was true. They just loved to argue over anything. They just loved to disagree. They just loved to get after one another. And he said it was a mess. And so one Sunday he went in and he had a sermon, and then at the end of the sermon, he made a petition that was very interesting. He said, now, everyone here, I want you to do something for me next week. I want you to go home and bake a cake and bring it to church next week. Now, people immediately wondered, well, why do we bring cakes? And he said, well, I'll tell you next week. And of course, the people liked him, so they went home, and that was before you could go to the store and buy cake, ready-made cake. So they went home and they collected the eggs, and they collected the flour, and they collected the sugar and the salt, and they collected the butter, and they collected all the ingredients, and then they mixed them together, and then they fired up the ovens, and then on Saturday late afternoon they baked their cakes, and you can imagine that some of them baked their cakes at that early morning, and you can imagine how those houses smelled with all those cakes baking. And when they finally came to church, everybody brought their cake, and they put their cake next to them in the pew, and they were wondering what was going to happen. And my grandfather started the service, and they had the hymns, and they had the offering and all the other things that they do. And then they finally had the sermon, and people wondering, well, what about the cakes? What about the cakes? And he just didn't seem to be in any hurry at all. And when he finished the service, finally, just short of closing the service out, he finally looked to his people and he said, church, did you bring your cakes? And everybody said, yes, we brought our cakes. Now what are we going to do with them? And he told them, now I want you to take your cake, and I want you to take it to the person that you most disagree with in this church. That was brave. Who would you take your cake to? I imagine some people got more than one cake. Do you think I'm right on that? I imagine some people didn't get any cake at all. And they probably wish they'd been more disagreeable once they smell those cakes. The point is, church, the only thing that's going to win this world is going to be our faith and our love and our hope. And those cakes changed that church. So let me ask you this. Do you think anybody's going to bring you their cake? And we as a church, in love, in faith, and hope, said, Amen.